Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Cool. So look, we find ourselves at a really interesting moment in the conversation about data and analytics and the effects they have on industry and on society. A couple of years ago, I would give a talk like this one to a room like this one, and it was all about hype, for lack of a better term. You would see statistics cited like this, where IBM determined in some way that 90% of the world's data was created in the past 2 years. And this is kept up pretty consistently, where if you measure data in a very literal way in terms of the number of bytes of information that have been created by human civilization and stored somewhere in a reachable space, 90% of the information is 2 years old or less. But although that's impressive, that also ought to make you very nervous, because 90% of the useful information was not created in the past 2 years. Maybe 0.9% was, or something like that instead. But the contrast between, I think, the promise of big data and analytics, and I work in the space of prediction, where we're trying to forecast events, and we do it probabilistically instead of deterministically. But still, one might argue that if data is making us smarter, we should be better about predicting things, and instead you see a lot of very unpredictable things happening. You see Donald Trump getting elected president in the United States, for example. You see lots of global events. You see hurricanes. We talked about weather. I had to leave a day early. At least that forecast was correct about the weather being very bad in New York. But we see financial crisis. We now see a backlash in the US and in Europe against social media. Lots of events that we thought, we get more data and now life is more predictable. That might not really be true. And so I'm worried about a backlash against good work that's being done. Most technologies have what is called a hype cycle. This is a chart put together by Gartner Group, which is a technology research firm. And they show what happens when a new technology is being adopted by the market. So initially, you have a technology trigger. So you have some new excitement over something, and you see the peak of inflated expectations. And that's when there is massive amounts of excitement, massive amounts of hype, where people think that, hey, I can have a push-button solution, this new technology, big data, or artificial intelligence, or machine learning, or whatever else, right? That this technology will solve all of my business and my human problems at the push of a button. What people realize, though, is that, hey, it actually takes a little bit more time than that. It takes a little bit more time to figure out what the pitfalls are, to figure out, first of all, who the people who actually have knowledge and mastery of this technology are. You have to learn a lot through trial and error, what the constraints are in terms of privacy and security, things that people are learning right now. And so what happens is that you often have a backlash, the so-called trough of disillusionment, where people realize, hey, you know what? The world's still a complicated place, and this technology is a way to make it slightly less complicated, but is not a fix for every solution. And then you kind of have a plateau of productivity where people realize, you know what? Actually, technology is quite useful. It makes many things easier, but it doesn't solve all the world's problems. So what I want to do in this talk today, or in your thinking, is to push us forward on that curve, to talk honestly through some of the problems, some of the challenges, so we kind of achieve productivity later on. And by the way, this is not unique to analytics or big data. If you look, for example, at computing technology, there were lots of studies in the 1980s that would say, how come computers haven't had more of an impact on society? Well, it actually took 10 or 15 years from the time that computers became widespread in offices and homes to where they really increased productivity in the US and Europe on a large scale. And by the way, since I'm a data-driven guy, there actually is some evidence that we are at peak hype. So I define hype one way is by the number of mentions of the term big data in corporate press releases, and we actually have seen this year a decline, or last year, 2017, a decline in how often big data was mentioned. Sometimes it's replaced by terms that are synonymous, like I mentioned, machine learning, artificial intelligence. I think there isn't necessarily that much sophistication in kind of which buzzwords are used, but you do see a little bit of a pullback or a backlash. And again, remember, that can be good because it means that we're moving through that trough toward actual enlightenment, we hope. But what are some of the challenges that when you begin to be a practitioner in the space of analytics, you begin to realize? Well, one very basic problem is that as we get more data, instead of having more consensus over how the world works, instead we have more disagreement often. This is a scatter plot showing every poll conducted, every national poll in the US presidential election in 2016. And so you see Hillary Clinton, the Democrat, in blue, Donald Trump, the Republican, is in red. If you see this whole kind of mess of dots, it's not very obvious necessarily how you connect the dots. And so every different model has different ways to do it, but it's not a straightforward problem. So this, for example, is the version that, that 538, which is my website, used. These are national polls. We have an electoral college in the United States, but putting that aside for the time being, you can also look at national polls and see what the popular vote is supposed to turn out like. But there are big debates about how people should connect these dots and how people should make an election forecast. At the time, in 2016, people were mad at my site because we had Trump with a higher chance, with about a 30% chance than other sites, and that was controversial. People wanted comfort. They wanted to hear that, hey, the data proves that Clinton is going to win for sure. One model that we compete with had Clinton with a 99% chance, and we had her with a 70 or a 71% chance instead. It turned out that it was good to have a model that showed more uncertainty, that Trump outperformed his polls, not by that much, but by enough, in the middle part of the country, in the Midwest, where I'm from originally, and that was enough to swing a very close race from Trump to Clinton instead. But the point is that all these forecasts, all these models use the same data, and they're really different numbers. Some people think that 30% versus 1% are very similar. They're not similar at all. One is saying that this event would occur 1 in every 3 times. One is saying only 1 out of every 100 times instead. So even in a case where you have a fairly well-defined problem, lots of disagreement about how you model and interpret that evidence. Problem number 2 is that as you get more data, the degree of complexity in the world tends to increase. Look, data is not data for its own sake. Data is about finding relationships and connections and understanding ultimately how causality works. I'm traditionally trained in that way, where I'm a kind of scientific method, hypothesis-driven guy. I want to find how A connects to B and how A predicts B ultimately. But as you increase the amount of data in your universe, if you go from, for example, 5 data points to 10 data points, you begin to see an exponential increase in the number of relationships that you can study. So economic data, for example, the US government now tracks about 508,000 data series in real time, so domestic data and international data. And you can run lots of correlations. You can correlate, for example, the average unemployment rate in New York City to economic growth in Los Angeles or whatever else, and run these relationships and try and figure out what causality is. But you're working in a very large space where just looking at like two-way relationships, how does A affect B? There are now 258 million, or billion rather, combinations that you can test. The problem with this is that you run into a concern with false positives, that when you have kind of an infinitely large data space, you can find 1 in a million relationships that occur as a result of chance alone. And we see, if you guys are familiar with academic work, the replication crisis, meaning that there are lots of peer-reviewed academic papers that find with high statistical confidence a positive finding, and they can't be replicated very accurately at all. And so when we have so many different ways to run experiments, to run tests, so much data to look at, this becomes a big problem, and you have to verify things in more robust ways. Again, a challenge people might not have realized when we were in the peak of the hype cycle a couple of years ago. Third, and related, we're also always operating, or most of the time, in competitive environments. We're in the real world, we're making decisions. People elsewhere in our city or elsewhere in our industry are making decisions as well, and our decisions affect theirs and vice versa. But I live in New York City. I was giving a talk a couple of years ago at the Guggenheim Museum in New York, and so Manhattan, although it's very crowded and very busy for traffic, it's also just a linear street grid. So if, for example, I want to go from where I live on 30th Street to the Guggenheim on 89th and 5th, in theory, this is what Google Maps would recommend. You make just one right turn, or one left turn, rather, on 5th Avenue, and you get there in all the traffic 20 or 30 minutes later. So that's the route that Google recommended. By contrast, this is the route that my Uber took that day instead. So we crossed through Central Park 3 times and finally got there after doing a loop-de-loop about 40 minutes late. So again, Uber, I know we don't have it in Hamburg, I don't think, but it's a very good technology for the most part and good navigationally. So why did the GPS recommend this route to my driver instead of the more straightforward way? Was it actually a shortcut? Was it actually saving me time? Or was it just kind of a bug or a glitch in the system? And the answer was that was completely a bug. It was badly designed software. And the reason why is that there's a route that cuts north to south through Central Park called East Drive. And the GPS determined correctly that there was no traffic at all on East Drive. And so therefore it said, I'm going to try really hard to get to this route, the shortcut, because once I'm on the shortcut, I'm home free. No traffic in Manhattan at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday is great. The problem is that East Drive was closed that time of day. East Drive was only open at rush hour at 9 a.m. and at 5 p.m. And so what the GPS thought was a feature, hey, I found this amazing route for you, was really just badly designed software instead. And as obvious as that might be, if we are in a competitive space and making big bets, this was betting that, hey, look, all the other 3 million people in Manhattan are idiots. They don't know about this shortcut. And I, the one heroic taxi driver, will save you lots of time, Nate, instead. You know, not very plausible. But when we are operating in urban spaces and spaces where we have competitive markets, we have to be especially worried about the risk that if we have an unconventional solution that we have, that maybe we have a bug in our code, maybe we made the mistake and not society instead. So what are some habits of mind and some best practices to try and navigate the thicket of big data and actually get smarter? Well, I think it all stems from something called Bayes' theorem. Bayes' theorem, I know many of you know it, is a centuries-old algebraic formula. It's quite simple in some ways, but it's about how do you incorporate new information given what you already know. So there are several things that are important about Bayes' theorem, one of which is that we're never from a totally neutral starting point. In the real world here, working with big data, working with all types of data, in practice, we come in with prior beliefs, we come in with some idea about how the world works. It's never a pure experiment. Instead, we're working in the real world. However, we synthesize information over time, and over time, eventually get better. So these are kind of 3 principles that stem from Bayes' theorem. So number 1, think probabilistically. Number 2, know where you're coming from. I'll explain that one in a moment. And number 3, the importance of trial and error. So I'm a little bit obsessed with weather. We have quite variable weather in the Midwest where I'm from and in New York where I live now. But weather is also an area where there is intrinsic unpredictability beyond a certain point, and conveying uncertainty is really important. So this example comes from a state in the US called North Dakota, which is a very cold, very rural state in the north of the United States. And in North Dakota, you have a lot of snow every year. And then finally, in the spring, about this time of year, the snow begins to melt, but you have the risk of a flood. If the snow melts really quickly and the water accumulates, you can have flooding along the Red River, for example, which is depicted in this very ugly PowerPoint slide here. But 1997, you had a record snowfall in North Dakota, and the National Weather Service issued a forecast saying, we think at the peak of the flood in the spring, in March, almost exactly this time of year, in fact, that the waters will peak at 49 feet in North Dakota. People there, though, are pretty educated. They said, look, we have flood walls that go up to 51 feet instead. So 51 is larger than 49, and it'll be a close call, but what's the problem, really? The problem is this, that the Weather Service forgot to tell people, or declined to tell people, what the margin of error in their forecast was, which is about plus or minus 9 feet instead. And so, in fact, the water would crest at 53 feet, which was well within the margin of error, but it caused 3/4 of the town to have their property damaged or destroyed. This This is a slow-moving flood. It's not like a hurricane type of event, and so it's not like people didn't have notice a day or so in advance, but it meant that you had lots and lots of property that could have been insured, where you could have had property damage avoided, and instead it was a kind of billion-dollar disaster for this part of the United States. And the reason why was that the Weather Service was afraid to depict the uncertainty in their forecast. They thought that if they told people what the uncertainty was, that people wouldn't believe the forecast at all. Instead, the most valuable information in the forecast was all about the uncertainty and depicting what was actually a 35% chance of a catastrophic flood. I don't mean, by the way, to pick on weather forecasters too much. They've gotten a lot better at what they do. You see, for example, the trajectories they had for Hurricane Irma before it hit Florida last year. They've gotten about 250% better over the past 25 years about predicting landfall locations for hurricanes. But hurricane forecasting is very probabilistic. You see a cone of uncertainty. Weather is a complex system in the literal definition of the term. But between technology, between having, frankly, a lot of practice, where weather is forecast every day, and between understanding the chemistry and the physics of the system, weather forecasting has gotten a lot better. And we try and adopt some of this attitude when looking at election forecasts as well. So you see now the Electoral College, a fairly wide spread of possible outcomes. People in general are overconfident, and that includes data scientists that are overconfident and don't realize how wide, even with good information, even with good algorithms, the spread of outcomes is often quite wide, and people are only sometimes prepared for the middle outcome, and that can lead to underpreparedness for everything from hurricanes to Donald Trump becoming president, for example. Idea number 2, know where you're coming from. So again, under Bayes' theorem, we always start out with what's called a prior belief. So we have an estimation of how likely a certain event might be. We have some information about the system. Maybe that information is good or bad, but we're never starting out from neutral. What's important, though, is that inherently our points of view are inherently subjective. I'm not being a postmodernist. I think there is an objective reality out there, but by definition, any one person's point of view is subjective. That means it can and will be subject to biases and preferences and prejudices and whatever else. So this slide depicts, if you guys have read Sheryl Sandberg is the COO of Facebook, her book, Lean In, talks about how there is gender discrimination in the workforce in some industries, including the tech sector. And there are experiments done where if you give, for example, hiring managers identical resumes, but one of them has a female-sounding name and one has a male-sounding name, the male name, despite the same credentials, will get more second-round interviews, will be more likely to be offered a job, it turns out. So this is not a new finding. What her studies discover, though, is that actually the people who are most likely to discriminate are the people who say they have no gender bias whatsoever. Those people have more implicit bias than the people who say, yeah, you know what, my industry is traditionally male-dominated, I have to be conscious and aware of that, and then when I am aware of that, then I actually make the better hiring decision, hire the more qualified employee, regardless of gender, more often. So being aware of where you come from and what biases you bring to the table, and by the way, also having teams that have different skill sets that are diverse in different ways, is a big part of discerning together what the objective reality is really like. And the last idea here, try and error. So before I became a data scientist and a journalist, I played poker professionally for a couple of years. It's a great way to kind of hone your instinct for probability, but this guy here is named Chris Moneymaker. Chris Moneymaker was an accountant from Nashville, Tennessee, in the middle of the United States. He entered an online poker tournament, so deposited $20, won that tournament, then won a seat in the real World Series of Poker in Las Vegas, Nevada, the biggest poker tournament in the world, and won that tournament too. So he went from $20 to $2 million. It's not quite rags to riches. He was an upper middle class accountant and became a temporary poker millionaire, but still was a very good kind of made for TV story. But if you see poker on TV, it's a lot easier than in the real world because you see kind of what hands your opponent has. It's as though you have X-ray vision when seeing poker on TV. But online, lots of people went online and played poker, and I, having pretty good sense for mathematics, having played poker a little bit a couple of years earlier in college, I would play against them and made a good deal of money for a couple of years. I also collect a lot of data on my opponents. So you see, for example, over the long run, online tables had 10 players typically, how much each player is winning or losing. So one thing you learn, for example, is that, first of all, most players lose money in poker because the house takes a cut, but also the worst players are subsidizing the rest of the tournament. The worst players are losing almost $400 an hour, and so it's really easy. It's a lot easier to be really bad at something than to be really good at something is one thing that I learned. It also shows that there is kind of an 80-20 curve that you may have heard in marketing or other languages when it comes to adopting new technology, where generally speaking, initially, the first 20% of learning that you do can push you pretty far, potentially. If in poker you go from playing every hand like a total idiot to using basic strategy. So basically in poker, basic strategy means that you raise when you have a good hand, you fold when you have a bad hand, and you call when you have a medium strength hand. That's not a very creative way to play. You're actually supposed to bluff a fair amount in poker. But still, just playing things the basic way, you'll go from losing $400 an hour to losing only $200 an hour, $20 an hour instead. However, to really make progress and become a winning player, you have to learn more advanced strategy instead. And similarly, when kind of working in big data environments, trial and error, iterating. If you look at companies like Facebook, for example, or Google, or companies that really have learned how to improve and iterate, it's not like one big idea behind it. It's trying something, experimenting, making mistakes, frankly, having to pull back, having to admit error, but slowly progressing a little bit over time. And it's kind of through that technique, through trial and error, through repeated work, and through testing on real people, because your ideas may or may not actually work in the real world, that's where you gain your competitive advantage over your competitors or over your opponents. So, don't always look for like the big, gigantic wins. Sometimes the incremental improvement repeated over time, that's how it works in Bayes' theorem, where you get a little bit better all the time. That's where your competitive advantage can come from. So I'll leave you with this thought in the form of a poem from Piet Hein, who's a Danish scientist and author. The Road to Wisdom. Well, it's plain and simple to express error and error and error again, but less and less and less. So thank you very much.